years, China has been breaking records in emerging technologies such as financial technology, the sharing economy and artificial intelligence, fueling its Made in China 2025 project to bolster domestic high-tech industries. At the same time, China is also facing a kind of technology blockade from the West. The U.S. is taking trade actions against China under the Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, investigating into Beijing's intellectual property and technology transfer practices. European countries are also leading efforts for the European Union to tighten the screening regime for Chinese investment. So what is behind China's flourishing achievements in the tech world, and is the tech blockade fostering greater innovation from China? Joining me for the discussion are Denis Simon, Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke Kunshan University, Dawei Li, CEO of China Thinkers Bureau, and Thomas Luo, co-founder, CEO and editor-in-chief of Pingwest, an English-Chinese bilingual tech media. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Gentlemen, do you believe there's a Cold War on technology between developed countries in the West and China?
I think it's a little bit too much to suggest that it's a Cold War, but clearly I think the West is starting to feel the pressure from China's emergence now as a much more significant player in global technology markets. It used to be that most of the collaboration and interaction was based on an asymmetrical relationship between China and the West. As China has increasingly improved its domestic capability, today what we've seen is much more symmetry, and therefore there's much more context now to feel that kind of pressure within Western markets, and also in terms of the development of new technology now that's going to define the new cutting edge for the 21st century.
Well, however, the New York Times, in a very recent article, claimed that a Cold War is being waged across the world's most advanced industries, and it just got a lot chiller. So, Mr. Li, how do you see the situation?
New York Times is a great media, reputable media, but often kick the dust. We shouldn't listen 100% to what New York Times is saying. I can say there is no Cold War between China and the U.S., but probably we have some skirmish in between. Like any sustainable and healthy relationship between two parties, boyfriend and girlfriend, husband and wife, there is no war. There shouldn't be any war, but there is some skirmish, daily argument in between. That is a very common phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. And Luo, Mr. Luo?
Yeah, I think this Cold War is a very serious term, you know that. So, yeah, I don't think the Cold War is really happening, but there has been some kind of the very direct computation or this kind of the interaction between the China and the West, particularly for this kind of the most cutting-edge technology development. Like, I just give an example, like the artificial intelligence. It's no doubt that the U.S. is still the first one and who has the strong talents and capability of doing the most cutting-edge artificial technology intelligence studies in the world, while China just reached to the second. So I think when this situation happens, when this kind of when China just going faster to show its power of the technology innovation, I think, and there must be some kind of the computation at the current moment. So I'm not sure if it's Cold War, but I think it's kind of the competition. Well, probably it might be going to some kind of the Cold War if this kind of thing's going worse, or someone trying to make some kind of the blockade or this sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, if you look at where I work in my domain in academia, if you look at the research community, if you look at everything outside of government, actually the level of collaboration and cooperation is expanding.
Yeah, sure.
It's expanding. And a lot of people, I think, are ignoring the fact that China and the U.S., China and the EU are becoming more and more interdependent. And the level of, like, for example, joint publications of articles is increasing. The level of corporate collaborative R&D, we see the Google project and the Apple project now coming to China to work in AI. These are all indications that the relationship outside of government is still growing and expanding, even if the governments are not able to agree with one another.
Well, these are the things that these are the things that the media probably doesn't talk about so much, right? Because it's not very sexy, it's not very catchy when you put it on the growing cooperation. However, we are looking at, as I mentioned, for instance, this kind of investigation into China's so-called forced transfer technology, and the list is coming out as far as right now is concerned. And then European countries, not just the governments, but also a lot of scholars are really raising the bar and they're warning against Chinese government influence. What are the concerns that's being reflected behind the headline? Maybe that is too simple.
Yeah, I think we should let our Western politicians, Western people know that the world is new, the world is different. So that China is growing richer and bigger and stronger with more confidence, but in a humble way. We are seeking for the harmony in between. So although we are getting stronger, we are more powerful. China has their domestic innovation capacity. The hugest domestic market in the world. But also China should be a great partner rather than competitors. In the past, like 20, 30 years ago, when China is still poor, we are growing our power, we are growing our muscles. So the Western people love to give their emphasis to us. Think China is learning, we should help them. Nowadays, we can help ourselves, Chinese people, Chinese companies, earning their great competitive edge in the global market. I think in the coming decade, the Western world, both European countries and our greatest friend, United States, should get used to the fact that we have a new partner, new player in the center of the stage. The world is different.
However, they are using the excuse of, or the reason of national security. For instance, Huawei, as civilian, as cheap and good the services are, is being blocked for use in the United States. Thomas, what is your view on this?
Yeah, I think for Huawei or for some kind of the Chinese companies, they are staying in a very tricky moment. I think is firstly, and they provide. Huawei is a very tricky case because Huawei sells their phones and their instruments into Europe quite well, but they was fully blocked by the U.S. I don't know the reason why. Why just the EU accept Huawei while the U.S. just rejected totally? I don't know the reason why. So
well, they think that Huawei, when they provide a headset for the American customers, one day they can switch it off or weaponize this kind of headsets.
So let's think in another way. Why we don't think these kind of things like what Google or Apple will do to the China market?
That is the problem.
That is the problem.
Nobody asked that question.
Yeah. So I think it is very interesting. Just for us, I think the most important thing is that to show how China will contribute to the world in terms of the tech innovation or in terms of the intellectual properties. I think we do contribute a lot to the world, and we can contribute more to the world. And like so far we know, Google is trying to set up their AI innovation center in China, while another one in Paris. I think that's a very good case to show how the smartest Chinese scientists and engineers can contribute to Google and to the world to show their smart and their wisdom and their capability of the artificial intelligence studying and research. I think this is a very great case. So firstly, we can contribute a lot, and so that's the way that we can show.
That's the way how we see it, and we would like people to perceive us as such. However, Mr. Simon.
Right. Yeah. No. But you have to understand the systems are structured very, very differently, and so the connectivity, for example, between military and civilian affairs in China is a much more amorphous kind of one. In the U.S., it's much more sharply defined. And so, therefore, a lot of things that go on in China we see as a kind of nefarious in terms of motivation. And so the U.S. government, I think, some of these issues are not new. They've been going on since 1978 when the two countries first started to interact in the open period. There were export controls, there was something called COCOM, and clearly there was an extensively long list of things that were denied for export to China. That list has become significantly shorter and shorter and shorter. And now we're down to perhaps the most critical technologies that are involved that are called dual-use technologies. And these technologies can have ostensibly both military and civilian applications. And that's precisely where the sensitivity lies. No one is really clear
However, 5G technology, you know, Huawei providing this 5G connectivity equipment, how civilian, how military can you defy that? I mean, you can say, okay, you can switch it off and then it becomes a weapon. Well, a lot of things can be switched off. How do you...
But we've seen silly things happen. For example, we had U.S. uniforms for the American military being made in China, and then there were all of a sudden a regulation went in and said you can no longer, you know, make those uniforms in the People's Republic of China. They have to be made in the United States. I mean, it's very hard to imagine what's wrong with just having those military uniforms sewn and put together in China. Meaning that we are in a period. I mean, I think you highlight something that's very important. We are in a period in which people are responding to the impact of globalization. And they're starting to see that maybe my national interests are not always best served by greater openness and greater engagement. And perhaps maybe other countries who are engaged in these kind of activities may have different motivations. And so, you know, we're at a period in which the level of trust between the two governments, between the Europeans and the Chinese also government, are at a very uneasy stage right now. And particularly in terms of some of the things that happened in the aftermath of the 19th Party Congress and the Lianghui, people are wondering where Xi Jinping is really headed and what he wants to accomplish. And I think that while no one knows for sure, people are kind of being much more cautious. And I think you have to also remember that President Trump is President Trump. He's different than any president we've had in the modern era, and he's taking a much more difficult line against China, and we're not really clear where that's headed. And I think a lot of Americans, even if they have some agreement with pieces of that policy, don't really agree with the whole policy because of the level of connectivity between the two countries is much higher than the Trump administration would admit.
Well, of course, those concerns, some of them we can understand, and I think even legitimate. However, somehow these kind of policies, for instance, I'm not going to allow you to come into my country, I'm not going to allow you to sell my product. That reminded me of what happened in Qing Dynasty 150 years ago. I mean, it's like, I close my door, whatever you do outside is your business, but I'm here, I'm protecting myself. Mr. Li, what do you think of my comparison?
That is a beautiful thing. Mr. Trump always proclaimed that his ideal president would be President Lincoln, the greatest president of the United States. But also, he should also read the biographies from President Truman, MacArthur, Eisenhower, and President Kennedy. Back to 1950 and 1960s, those three great presidents invested heavily from federal level to the R&D for the United States. That's why we have Silicon Valley. That's why we have the knowledge new world. But the knowledge, I checked with The Economist magazine, so the federal government only invests 0.6% of the GDP of the United States to the R&D sector, which is only a quarter of what had been doing in the 1960s. So Trump should listen to the great president and invest more domestically rather than fighting with other people.
Right. I think people need to understand. I mean, sometimes there are basic facts we think that are just normal basic facts, but maybe our audience don't really understand that. In contrast to what President Trump puts in scientific research and scientific research, China puts 280 billion US dollars in 2017. That is over 2% of the GDP. So
almost getting close to 2.5%.
Right. So that explains why China is, you know, going ahead.
Sure. I mean, if you actually look at the data over the last 6 or 7 years, Chinese investment in R&D has been growing twice as fast as the growth of GDP. So even when GDP was growing 10%, R&D spending was growing over 20%. And to be very honest, there was a period of time where money, you know, spending more money didn't necessarily buy more innovation. But what we see over the last 6 or 7 years is a whole array of policies that have been invoked now designed to improve the performance of the R&D system. And that's why we're starting to see the results. It's these analogous improvements in terms of the way talent is being managed, the greater emphasis on small and medium enterprises, and a bunch of other things now that are yielding greater results from the investment So there's been really a fundamental change. And so the question was never whether if China was going to become technologically more capable. It was only when this was going to happen. And I can honestly say I think most people in the West are encountering what you would call a technological surprise. They weren't yet ready for China to reach this level of achievement.
Because they don't know the kind of money and energy and
money and
resources
investment
that's being put into R&D. And this has been happening for a long time. So you have been watching a special program on the point that we're talking about China's technological competition with developed countries in the West. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us. Welcome back to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. My guests today are Denis Simon, Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke Kunshan University, Dawei Li, CEO of China Thinkers Bureau, and Thomas Luo, co-founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Pingwest. So, gentlemen, looking ahead, how should China react to this kind of seemingly blockade from the developed countries?
Yeah, I think in China now has a very clear roadmap or has a very clear strategy to face with this kind of the challenge. And firstly, I just listened to Premier Li Keqiang's press conference, and he told and he re-emphasized that China will never enforce the foreign companies to transfer their core technology into the Chinese domestically. So I think this is a very important promise to show how we deal with this kind of the technology competition, how we deal with this kind of the technology communication and interaction. We don't try to steal, or we don't want to grab your technology, and we need to collaborate in more flexible ways. But I think this is a very important thing. I don't think there's a boundary where there's a wall can ban the scientist or the smartest guys or the scientists or the smartest entrepreneurs between U.S. and China to communicate with each other. And now I see that by the middle of 2017, I think, and over 10% of the AI-related papers are collaborative, written by the scientists between U.S. and China.
People do have concerns, right? People do have short-term interests to take care of, to protect even. Look at the cases of Germany, Italy, France. They're talking about don't be too naive, and they're not sure about China's political motivations and in light of the perceived increased political influence from China. So, Mr. Li, how should we really handle the situation so that we are not seeing... Yes, of course, while there is growing cooperation, how should we cater to people's needs and do in a way that their interests can be protected as well?
Like I mentioned, the European. In fact, European is not the European Union as an economy. Not would be the best, probably not the best practice of the history, because it's too much collectivism. So Germany has been hostile to Chinese technological trade and communication, because Germany want to keep their leading position both internationally and as well as in the European nations. So they want to keep their technology edge. But many other European countries, they want to sell their product to China. They've been having appointment with Jack Ma to sell their grass product and apples, juice, and clothes and beautiful glass to Chinese market. So I think probably like Mr. Lamy, the CEO of the General Secretary of WTO mentioned last week. So if we couldn't keep the plan A, we should have the plan B. So if the international treatment and argument could be maintained as good as before, we can have bilateral talks between nations, one-on-one, like China can have another deal with Germany, another deal with France, and with some other countries. So that could be plan B, but B probably stands for better.
The only problem is, so China has begun this series of innovation dialogues with a number of countries. But unfortunately, the Trump administration, just when the dialogue with the United States was getting to be fruitful and productive, it was cut out. And when the Trump administration came in, they did not staff out the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. They have not put anyone in who's the key point person for science and technology collaboration with China. So we're not getting that kind of big macro view. And I think, you ask, what should be done. Last year, former Vice Premier Liu Yandong went to the United States, and she talked a lot about the importance of people-to-people diplomacy, that even in the midst of tensions between the governments, the level of engagement at the level of states and cities and non-governmental organizations and universities, etc., needs to keep continuing to grow. And I think that actually that is the case. I think we as we suggested before, we're seeing this kind of growth occur. We're seeing a more and more commitment, not because just simply it's a nice or cute thing to do, because the nature of innovation is, in the 21st century, a collaborative enterprise.
Yeah.
The days of the Lone Ranger, one country doing it on its own, that no longer is a valid model to pursue innovative activities. And so universities understand this. They understand the role of knowledge networks. They understand the role of cross-border collaboration. And they set the tone now and the model for what's happening, followed by companies who are also now setting this tone. If you ask a multinational company, where are you going to put your next R&D center, the surprising answer is China. And you say, well, how could that be?
It's not a surprising answer.
Well, it's surprising because they complain about IPR, they complain about cybersecurity, they complain about data protection, yet they're going to put their R&D center in. So what is it that China has that they want? It's talent. It's high-end talent.
Yeah.
And the name of the game at the end of the day, maybe it's not a Cold War over technology, it's really a competition for the best talent in the world and the best minds. And what we're starting to see is more and more of the young entrepreneurs who might have stayed in the States from China are now coming back to China to pursue their ventures. Because now, under the regime, under the policy set up by Xi Jinping, China is now more receptive to what Li Keqiang has called individual innovators or young entrepreneurs. And the environment for technological entrepreneurship in China is the best that it's been over the last 25, 30 years.
I think for those people who have this kind of black and white or win-lose mentality, they're going to see more surprises because China has set up this administration of immigration, which means China is determined, right, to lure more talents to come into China. And at the same time, in the United States, the policy is seems to be, at least for the moment, in the other direction. Mr. Luo, you are in the hiring business for talents. You know the competition the best.
Yeah, sure. I always hang out with this kind of the Chinese guys who once lived in Silicon Valley, and I just noticed. So till now, I still just stay in both in Silicon Valley and in Beijing, probably 80% in Beijing, rather 20% in Silicon Valley. I just see I can rarely meet my old friends in Silicon Valley now because I can meet them in Beijing. Because during the past 5 years, they all moved back. I think what prompted them to move back is because of the opportunities and the chances happening in China. While so the biggest worry for me is that, okay, if this kind of the so-called technological Cold War happened, or if this getting worse, I think it's really unfair to those people who got educated in U.S. and then had worked there for several years. When they determined to going back to China, or they still live in Silicon Valley or in the U.S. to try to get some kind of a collaboration with the Chinese organizations, and they will be treated as the spy or this sort of things, and they will be treated as you are stealing the technology, and we'll transfer them from U.S. to China. I think this is really unfair to those kind of guys. They're really smart guys, and they're really good guys. They just try to make the collaboration.
Don't blame China for being able to lure these people back. If you make them under suspicion, I think one of the Marco Rubio, right? He was talking about Chinese scholars being a very important danger to the U.S. society.
Well, unfortunately, the Trump administration indicated late last year that it is under consideration to impose a series of policies with a number of Chinese students and scholars coming to the U.S. in so-called STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, that they will now start to reduce the numbers of visas available. I mean, that's something that as a leader in higher education, I think U.S. university presidents, for example, would oppose tremendously, because that would cut off an important connection point for, again, building these knowledge networks and where the future of collaborative research is headed. So it would be a terrible thing if that were to happen.
Yeah.
China and the state shouldn't and couldn't and wouldn't be the competitors, but they could be the great partners of human history. Here is a good example. So we have our great Steve Jobs, who invented the smartphone, but Apple are not able to produce enough billions of smartphones to the entire population of the world, which is a shame. But our mobile phone producers like Jiayin and OnePlus, and Huawei, and Xiaomi, we can produce billions of mobile phone smart devices under $100, under $50. Right. So sell to the Africa, sell to the poor nations. This is improving the overall good of human society. So in the future, I think China and the state could work like this as a partner continuously. So there is no competition, there is only partner things.
Right, but you have to realize, I mean, to be honest, China doesn't want to simply be at the low end of the value chain. And China wants to be at the top.
To the next level.
It wants to move. I mean, this is not about kind of dividing the world up between you take the poor countries and we'll take the rich countries. No, I really think that we have an opportunity now for the first time to leverage the capabilities of 2, 3, 4 major countries now. It's the additive value. 1 + 1 = 3 now, not 1 + 1 = 1.5. So there wasn't, to be really honest, there wasn't much value for many universities, etc., in pursuing real collaboration in China because there wasn't much to get. It was more or less give and don't get much in return. That's all changed now. That's all different. And so we're seeing people are starting to feel, wow, we're really engaged in China, and it's making some people very uneasy. That's really the problem.
Really?
Yes.
So what are we going to do? In one sentence, can you give some suggestions, some message to the people watching us out there?
I think that we have to continue to build bridges. I think the answer is that let's not be deterred by what's going on at this big higher level. It's sort of, a lot of it is atmospherics, a lot of it is noise, and let's keep pursuing what we're pursuing and keep the two countries as heavily engaged as possible to provide a kind of bulwark for the long-term development of the relationship over time.
Mr. Li, to wrap up, anything to say to the audience who are watching?
Yes. A government is only a small fraction of the entire society, entire world. We should, instead of looking at all the governmental decisions, we should put more focus and attention on the grassroots level, to the civil society, to the business sector, to the education sector.
To the normal, ordinary people.
Ordinary people. We can see there is no Cold War. There's probably some cold drinks. So we are celebrating a much brighter future.
Yeah, Thomas?
Yeah, sure. Just to keep curiosity to what China is happening, to keep curiosity to the smartest guys in China, what they are doing, and you will know, and there won't be war. There will be more collaboration and interaction. Yeah.
Thank you very much, 3 gentlemen, for coming on to our show. Joining us today have been Denis Simon, Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke Kunshan University, Dawei Li, CEO of China Thinkers Bureau, and Thomas Law, co-founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Pingwest. And that is it for this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.